John Kennedy. Here's a whisper from a nurse. The next day, she's on the news. The fluorescent lights of Walter Reed National Military Medical Center buzzed softly, casting a sterile glow over the quiet hallway. It was well past visiting hours, and the usual bustle of the day had settled into a gentle rhythm of beeping monitors and muffled footsteps. Marina Lell, a nurse in her late 20s, pushed a cart of medical supplies down the corridor, her blue scrubs slightly wrinkled from a long shift. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy bun, and faint shadows lingered under her eyes, evidence of too many nights spent tending to patients who carried wounds far deeper than those visible on their skin. Marina had been at Walter Reed for 3 years, drawn to the work not by ambition, but by a quiet promise she'd made long ago to care for those who returned from war broken, to give them the dignity others might overlook. Tonight, her focus was on room 114B, where specialist Dean Granger lay, a man whose silence spoke louder than words ever could. Dean was in his early 30s, pale and still, his bed a small island in a sea of machines that tracked his vitals with relentless precision. Both of his legs were gone, taken by an IED in Afghanistan, and with them, it seemed, went his voice. Trauma had locked his words away, leaving only his eyes to tell his story, hollow at times, but occasionally flickering with something Marina couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, or memory. She'd spent countless hours at his bedside, changing dressings, adjusting IV lines, and talking to him even when he didn't respond. She read to him sometimes snippets of poetry or stories she found in old magazines, but what seemed to reach him most were tales of courage and patriotism, the kind that reminded him of why he'd served. Marina didn't know why those stories stirred him, but she'd seen his fingers twitch or his gaze soften, and that was enough to keep her trying. Tonight, as she checked Dean's chart, the hospital felt different. There was a subtle tension in the air, a hushed urgency that hadn't been there when her shift began. Whispers among the staff hinted at an unexpected visitor, someone important, though no one seemed to know exactly who. Marina paid it little mind. Her world was here in the quiet rooms where soldiers fought battles no one else could see. She adjusted Dean's blanket, her hands moving with the practiced care of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "You're doing all right, Dean," she murmured, though she wasn't sure if he heard her. "We'll get through tonight together." His eyes stayed fixed on the ceiling, but she thought she saw a slight blink, a sign he was still there somewhere beneath the silence. As she stepped back into the hallway, the sound of purposeful footsteps broke her focus. 2 men in dark suits, earpieces barely visible, moved with the kind of precision that suggested authority. Between them walked Senator John Kennedy, his presence unmistakable even in the dim light. His suit was crisp, his posture relaxed yet commanding, and his eyes scanned the hallway with a mix of curiosity and respect. Marina froze her cart, squeaking slightly as she stopped. She'd seen politicians before. Walter Reed was no stranger to high-profile visits, but this was different. There were no cameras, no reporters trailing behind, no entourage of aides, just the senator and his escorts moving quietly through the hospital like they didn't want to be noticed. Marina's heart thudded. She wasn't one for politics. Her world was too small for that, too grounded in the immediate needs of her patients. But she knew who John Kennedy was, a senator from Louisiana, a man known for his sharp wit and deep commitment to those who served. She'd heard him speak once, on a grainy TV in the break room, his voice carrying a conviction that stuck with her. Now here he was, passing within arm's reach, his gaze briefly meeting hers as he nodded politely. The Secret Service agents kept their eyes forward, their presence a silent reminder of protocol, but Kennedy's nod felt personal, like he saw her, not just the scrubs. She should have let him pass. That was the sensible thing, the expected thing. Nurses didn't stop senators in hallways. They didn't speak unless spoken to. But something stirred in Marina, a quiet urgency she couldn't ignore. It wasn't about her or even about Kennedy. It was about Dean, about the man in room 114B who hadn't spoken in months, who'd lost so much, and yet still found a way to smile when she read him stories of valor. She thought of the way his eyes had welled up earlier that day, not from pain, but from something deeper, something that felt like being seen. She couldn't let that go unnoticed, not when someone with the power to make a difference was standing right in front of her. Her mouth went dry and her hands tightened on the cart. The agents were already moving past Kennedy's footsteps, echoing softly. It was now or never. "Senator," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, trembling with the weight of what she was about to do. The word hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. One of the agents turned sharply, his hand hovering near his earpiece, but Kennedy stopped, his head tilting slightly as he looked back at her. "Yes?" he said, his tone gentle but curious, his southern drawl softening the edges of the moment. Marina swallowed, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice still low, as if she were afraid of breaking something sacred. "I'm just a nurse, but there's something I need to say, for someone who can't." The agent closest to her stiffened, his eyes narrowing, but Kennedy raised a hand, a subtle gesture that stilled the tension. He took a step closer, his expression open, inviting her to continue. "Go ahead," he said softly, and in that moment the hallway seemed to shrink, the world narrowing to just the two of them and the weight of her words. Her voice shook as she spoke, but she pressed on, driven by a force she didn't fully understand. "There's a patient in room 114B, specialist Dean Granger. He's a veteran, lost both legs in Afghanistan. He doesn't speak anymore, not since the trauma, but he listens. I read to him sometimes stories about courage, about this country. He smiles, sir. Not often, but he does. Today he cried, not because he was sad, but because he felt something, like he mattered." Her voice cracked and she paused, her eyes dropping to the floor. "He's losing hope. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Maybe because no one else really listens. Not the way he needs." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the hospital. Marina dared to look up, expecting to see impatience or dismissal, but Kennedy's face was unreadable, his eyes locked on hers. For a moment, she thought she'd made a mistake, that she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. But then he spoke, his voice low and steady. "What's his name again?" he asked. "Dean Granger," she said, her voice steadier now, as if saying his name grounded her. "Specialist Dean Granger." Kennedy nodded, a slow, deliberate motion, and his gaze drifted toward the direction of room 114B. "Thank you," he said simply, and with that he turned, his escorts falling into step as he walked down the hallway. Marina stood frozen, her hands still gripping the cart, her breath shallow. Had she done the right thing, or had she just made a fool of herself, risking her job for a moment of reckless hope? She didn't know, and the uncertainty gnawed at her as she watched Kennedy disappear around the corner. She forced herself to move, pushing the cart back toward the nurse's station, her mind racing. But curiosity, or maybe instinct, pulled her back toward room 114B. She paused at the door, peering through the small window. Inside, Kennedy stood by Dean's bed, his posture relaxed but attentive. One of the agents hovered near the door, but the other was outside, giving the moment a rare intimacy. Marina couldn't hear what Kennedy was saying, but she saw him place a small pin on the table beside Dean's bed, a gesture so deliberate it felt like a promise. Dean's eyes, usually so distant, seemed to focus, and for a fleeting moment, Marina thought she saw his fingers twitch, as if reaching for something he'd lost. Kennedy turned to leave, and Marina stepped back, her heart pounding. As he passed her in the doorway, he paused, his eyes meeting hers again. "You did the right thing," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made her chest tighten. Then he was gone, the sound of his footsteps fading into the quiet of the hospital. Marina leaned against the wall, her breath coming in short, shaky bursts. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if she'd given away a piece of herself she hadn't meant to share. But as she glanced back into Dean's room, she saw something new in his expression. A flicker of light, a spark that hadn't been there before. She didn't know what would come of this, if anything at all. She didn't know that her whispered words had just set something in motion, something far bigger than she could imagine. All she knew was that for the first time in a long time, she felt like she'd been heard. And maybe, just maybe, Dean had been too. The morning after Marina Lell's whispered plea to Senator John Kennedy, Walter Reed National Military Medical Center buzzed with an unusual energy. Nurses whispered in break rooms, doctors exchanged knowing glances, and even the custodial staff seemed to linger longer in the hallways, as if sensing something extraordinary had unfolded in the quiet hours of the night. Marina, however, was oblivious to the undercurrent. She clocked in for her shift with her usual routine, a quick sip of vending machine coffee, a glance at her patient list, and a deep breath to steel herself for another day of caring for those who carried the weight of war. Her blue scrubs were fresh, but the shadows under her eyes remained a testament to a sleepless night spent replaying her bold moment with the senator. Had she overstepped? Would there be consequences? She pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on the work ahead. Room 114B was her first stop, where specialist Dean Granger waited his silence a familiar companion. Inside Dean's room, the air felt different, though Marina couldn't quite place why. The machines beeped steadily, the curtains let in a soft morning light, and Dean lay as still as ever, his pale face turned slightly toward the window. But there on the small table beside his bed was the pin Kennedy had left, a small gleaming token that caught the light like a promise. Marina's breath caught as she approached, her fingers brushing the edge of the table. Dean's eyes flicked toward her, and for a moment she thought she saw something new in them, a spark of awareness that hadn't been there before. "Good morning, Dean," she said, her voice gentle but steady. "Looks like you had a visitor last night." She expected no response, but to her surprise, Dean's fingers twitched and his lips parted slightly, as if trying to form a word. It was fleeting, gone as quickly as it came, but it was enough to make her heart skip. She smiled, tucking the moment away like a treasure, and began her routine of checking his vitals. As she worked, the hospital's intercom crackled to life, a rare interruption in the morning calm. "Nurse Marina Lell, please report to administration." The voice was calm but firm, and Marina froze, her hands stilling on Dean's chart. A ripple of unease ran through her. Had someone reported her for speaking to the senator? Was she in trouble? She glanced at Dean as if he might offer an answer, but his eyes were fixed on the ceiling again. Taking a shaky breath, she smoothed her scrubs and made her way down the corridor, her sneakers squeaking softly against the polished floor. The hallway seemed longer than usual, and she noticed curious stares from colleagues, a nurse who paused mid-step, a doctor who offered a small, enigmatic smile. By the time she reached the administration office, her palms were clammy, and her mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Inside, a woman in a neatly tailored suit stood waiting, her expression warm but professional. "Miss Lell, I'm Elizabeth Carter, with Senator Kennedy's office. May we speak?" Marina's heart sank, then surged with confusion. She nodded, her throat too tight to respond. Carter gestured to a chair, and Marina sat feeling small and exposed under the fluorescent lights. "I'll get to the point," Carter said, her voice kind but direct. "Your conversation with the senator last night about Specialist Granger, it moved him. He asked me to follow up to learn more about you and Dean. But more than that, he wanted to make sure Dean gets the care he needs. And he wanted to thank you for speaking up." Marina blinked, her mind struggling to process the words. Thank her? She'd expected a reprimand, not gratitude. I didn't do anything special," she stammered. "I just wanted someone to know about Dean." Carter smiled, a glint of admiration in her eyes. "That's exactly why it matters. You spoke for someone who couldn't. That's not nothing." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small envelope. "The senator left this for you. It's not much, just a note. But he also asked that we ensure Dean's case is prioritized for additional support therapy equipment, whatever he needs." Marina took the envelope with trembling hands, her mind reeling. She mumbled a thank you barely audible, and Carter stood to leave, pausing at the door. "Oh, and Miss Lell, the press got wind of this. They're outside. I'd brace yourself." The door closed softly behind her, leaving Marina alone with the envelope and a growing sense of unease. The press. Marina's stomach twisted. She wasn't built for attention. Her world was quiet, contained within the walls of Walter Reed, where her work spoke louder than her voice. She opened the envelope, her fingers clumsy. Inside was a handwritten note, the script bold but neat. "Marina Courage wears many faces. Yours is one I won't forget. Thank you for reminding me why we serve. John Kennedy." She stared at the words, her chest tightening. It was real, all of it. Her whisper had been heard, and now the world was listening too. She tucked the note into her pocket, her resolve hardening. She had patients to tend to, and no amount of attention could pull her from that. Back on the floor, the hospital was abuzz. News vans had begun to gather outside their antennas, piercing the morning sky. Marina caught snippets of conversation as she passed the nurse's station. "Did you hear? That nurse who talked to Kennedy? It's all over social media already." She quickened her pace, her face burning. At Dean's room, she found him unchanged, but the pin on his table seemed to shine brighter, a silent witness to the night before. She checked his IV, her hands steady, despite the chaos in her mind. "You're causing quite a stir, soldier," she said softly, hoping to coax another flicker of response. This time Dean's hand moved, his thumb rising slowly, a deliberate gesture that stopped her cold. It was the strongest sign he'd given in months, and tears pricked her eyes. "That's it, Dean," she whispered. "Keep fighting." Her moment of quiet was shattered by a tap on the door. A colleague, Sarah, poked her head in, her eyes wide. "Marina, you need to see this." She held up her phone where a news headline blared, "Nurses Whisper to Senator Sparks Hope for Silent Veteran." Below it, a grainy photo showed Marina in the hallway, her cart beside her, Kennedy leaning in to listen. Marina's heart sank. How had they gotten that? She hadn't spoken to a single reporter. "They're calling you a hero," Sarah said, her voice tinged with awe. Marina shook her head, her voice firm. "I'm not a hero. I'm just doing my job." But Sarah's smile suggested the world saw it differently. By midday, the story had spread like wildfire. Social media posts piled up, each one retelling the tale of the nurse who dared to speak to a senator for a forgotten soldier. Strangers shared messages of gratitude. "Thank you for reminding us what compassion looks like." Others pledged support for veterans inspired by Dean's story. Marina avoided her phone, but the hospital's breakroom TV was tuned to a news channel where a reporter stood outside gesturing toward Walter Reed. "This is a story of quiet courage," the reporter said, "a nurse who gave voice to the voiceless." Marina turned away, her cheeks flushed. She didn't need it. All she wanted was for Dean to keep fighting for her patients to feel seen. As her shift ended, Marina slipped into the break room to grab her coat, hoping to avoid the reporters outside. On the table, she found a small envelope, different from the one Carter had given her. It was covered in crayon hearts, addressed simply to Nurse Marina. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a child's handwriting, uneven but earnest. "Dear Nurse Marina, my daddy is a soldier. He doesn't talk much since he came home. I told him about you and he smiled. Thank you for being brave. I want to be like you. Ellie." A drawing fell out showing a nurse holding a soldier's hand, a tiny girl watching with a heart above her head. Marina's vision blurred with tears. She clutched the letter, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and responsibility. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about Ellie Dean and every soul her whisper had touched. She stepped outside, bracing for the flash of cameras, but the reporters were respectful, kept at a distance by hospital security. One called out, "Nurse Lel, how does it feel to inspire a nation?" Marina didn't answer her focus on the path to her car. But as she drove home, Ellie's letter lay on the passenger seat, a reminder that her words had reached beyond room 114B. Back at Walter Reed Dean's room was quiet, but his thumb rose again when a nurse checked on him, a silent promise to keep going. And somewhere in a small house far away, a little girl named Ellie hugged her father, whispering Marina's story, unaware that her own words would soon spark something even greater. The days following Marina Lel's whispered plea to Senator John Kennedy transformed Walter Reed National Military Medical Center into a hub of quiet revolution. The hospital, once a sanctuary of routine healing, now pulsed with a new energy. Phones rang with inquiries, volunteers arrived with donations, and news vans lingered in the parking lot, their crews hoping to catch a glimpse of the nurse whose courage had ignited a national conversation. Marina, however, remained tethered to her work, moving through the chaos with the same steady focus that had always defined her. Her blue scrubs were her uniform, her patience, her priority, and room 114B, where specialist Dean Granger lay her anchor. The world outside was clamoring for her story, but Marina's heart was here in the quiet moments of care where a veteran's fleeting glance or subtle gesture spoke louder than any headline. Yet her small act of bravery was rippling outward, touching lives far beyond the hospital's walls, and setting in motion a movement she'd never intended to start. Each morning, Marina arrived to find her locker overflowing with letters. They came from every corner of the country, veterans sharing their struggles, families expressing gratitude, children scribbling notes of admiration. Some were neatly typed, others scrawled in trembling handwriting, but all carried a raw, heartfelt sincerity. A retired Air Force pilot from Nevada wrote, "I've felt invisible since I came home. Your story reminded me someone still sees us." A teacher from Missouri shared, "My brother, a Marine, hasn't spoken to us in years. He saw your story and called me last night." Marina read them during her breaks, often alone in the break room, her coffee untouched as tears traced her cheeks. She wasn't used to this. Her world had always been small, contained within the sterile walls of Walter Reed, where her work was her voice. Now strangers were thanking her, calling her a hero, and she didn't know how to carry that weight. She saved every letter, stacking them in a shoebox under her desk, each one a reminder that her whisper had reached further than she'd ever dreamed. The letters, especially little. Ellie's crayon-covered note sparked an idea that Marina couldn't shake. Late one night, as she sat by Dean's bedside, reading him a letter from a veteran about finding purpose after war, she noticed his fingers twitch, his eyes softening with something like recognition. It struck her that these words, simple, human, hopeful, had a power she hadn't fully grasped. What if she could share that power with others like Dean veterans across the country who felt forgotten? The next morning, she approached the hospital's IT team, a trio of tech enthusiasts who'd always been quick to help with her charting software. "I have an idea," she said, her voice hesitant but resolute. "A way for people to send voice messages to veterans in recovery, poems, stories, anything that feels personal, like a whisper from one soul to another." They loved it, and within days they'd built a simple online portal called the Whisper Project, where anyone could upload a short audio recording to be shared with patients. The response was staggering. On the first day, 89 recordings arrived, a choir singing Sweet Caroline, a grandfather reading a poem about home, a teenager sharing a letter about resilience. By the week's end, over 2,000 messages had poured in, a chorus of voices from every walk of life. Nurses at Walter Reed began playing them for patients, and the impact was immediate. A soldier in the trauma ward who'd refused to engage with therapy nodded along to a veteran's story of survival. A young woman with PTSD, her face usually blank, smiled faintly at a child's recitation of the Star-Spangled Banner. In room 101B, Marina played a recording of a college student reading a letter about second chances, and Dean's hand moved, his thumb rising in that familiar gesture of quiet defiance. "You hear that, Dean?" Marina said, her voice thick with emotion. "They're speaking to you." His eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw not just awareness, but a spark of determination, a sign he was still fighting. The Whisper Project wasn't the only sign of change. Dean's recovery, though gradual, was gaining ground. One morning, Marina arrived to find a physical therapist setting up parallel bars beside his bed, a harness ready to support his weight. "We're going to try something big today," the therapist said, her eyes bright with cautious optimism. Marina stood back, her heart pounding as Dean gripped the bars, his arms shaking with the effort. His face was etched with focus, sweat beading on his brow, and slowly, impossibly, he pulled himself upright, the harness steadying him. The room erupted in soft cheers. Marina, the therapist, a nurse who'd joined to assist. Dean's gaze found Marina, and he gave her a look that carried everything: gratitude, pride, a fire that had been buried too long. Then, with trembling effort, he raised his hand in a salute, his fingers steady despite the strain. Marina gasped, tears spilling over her hands, covering her mouth. A nurse snapped a photo, and by nightfall the image was everywhere, shared across social media, with captions like "Veteran stands after nurse's whisper" to Senator Kennedy. The photo fueled a new wave of attention, but it wasn't just about Dean. Marina's story had become a rallying cry, inspiring action across the country. Volunteers flooded Walter Reed, bringing books, blankets, and hours of their time to sit with patients. A local bakery delivered trays of pastries for the staff, a hardware store donated equipment for the therapy ward, and a national veterans organization launched a fund in Dean's name to support rehabilitation programs. Marina, though, remained grounded in her work, dodging reporters when she could. She didn't see herself as special, just a nurse doing what she'd always done. But one afternoon, while sorting through donations in a cluttered storage room, she found something that stopped her cold. Tucked behind a pile of old files was a box labeled Unclaimed 2011. Inside, in a faded velvet case, was a purple heart, its ribbon worn but vibrant, tagged with the name Charles McHenry, no next of kin. The discovery hit Marina like a wave. She couldn't bear the thought of a hero's sacrifice left to gather dust forgotten in a storage room. She brought the medal to the administration, who traced it to a veteran who'd died alone years ago, his grave a simple stone in a nearby cemetery. That weekend, Marina drove to the cemetery, the Purple Heart in her pocket, the air crisp with the promise of fall. She found Charles McHenry's grave unadorned and solitary, and knelt beside it. "You earned this, Charles," she whispered, placing the medal gently on the stone. "You're not forgotten." She didn't see the jogger who paused to take a photo, but by Monday the image was viral, shared with headlines like, "Nurse Honors Lost Hero After Whisper to Senator." The photo sparked a national movement. Project Honor returned to locate and deliver unclaimed medals to families or graves, ensuring no veteran's legacy was lost to time. Within months, dozens of medals found their way home, each one a story reclaimed. The letters kept coming, each one a thread in the tapestry of Marina's impact. One arrived anonymously, slipped under her locker door, its handwriting shaky but clear. It was from Dean's father, Peter Granger, who'd been estranged from his son since the injury. "I thought he was gone forever," he wrote. "The doctors said not to hope, but you believed in him. He called me last week, didn't speak, but held the phone like he wanted me to know he was there. You gave me my son back." Marina read it 3 times, her hands trembling, and pinned it to the whispers that echo wall where it joined hundreds of others. The wall had become a pilgrimage site, with families reading the letters aloud, their voices filling the veteran's wing with stories of hope. Visitors began adding their own notes, and patients who hadn't spoken in months started sharing their own stories inspired by the words they heard. The Whisper Project grew too adopted by hospitals nationwide. A nurse in Oregon played a recording for a patient who laughed for the first time in a year. A school in Alabama had every student record a message sparking a district-wide veteran support program. Marina didn't seek recognition, but her name was inseparable from the movement. One evening, a reporter caught her as she left Dean's room, her voice gentle but persistent. "Marina, why do you keep pushing forward? You've done so much." Marina paused, thinking of Charles McHenry's medal, Ellie's drawing, Dean's salute. "Because they still need me," she said, and walked away, her sneakers echoing in the quiet. Behind her, Dean's room glowed softly, the pin from Kennedy still on his table. A reminder that a whisper could kindle a flame that burned bright and long. Time had softened the edges of Marina Lell's moment in the spotlight, but the resonance of her whisper to Senator John Kennedy in the quiet hallway of Walter Reed National Military Medical Center endured like a melody carried on the wind. Years later, the hospital's sterile corridors still hummed with the steady rhythm of healing, but something had shifted. A subtle warmth, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. Marina, now in her mid-30s, remained a constant presence, her blue scrubs slightly faded, her dark hair still tied in a messy bun, her eyes carrying the same quiet resolve that had defined her work from the start. The world had tried to make her a hero, but she'd slipped back into the shadows, choosing the unglamorous labor of caring for veterans over the fleeting allure of fame. Yet her story had taken root, spreading far beyond room 140B, touching lives she'd never meet, and weaving lessons that would guide generations. Marina's days were anchored by her patients, each one a reminder of why she'd become a nurse. The hospital's Veterans Wing, once a place of somber routine, now felt alive with possibility. The Whisper Project, born from her idea to share voice messages with veterans in recovery, had grown into a national lifeline. Thousands of recordings poured in monthly, children reciting poems, veterans sharing tales of survival, strangers offering words of hope. Hospitals across the country played them, and the effect was profound. In a small clinic in Montana, a soldier who hadn't spoken in months hummed along to a teenager's guitar strum. In a bustling ward in Chicago, a woman with PTSD smiled at a grandmother's story of resilience. At Walter Reed, Marina saw the impact firsthand. Specialist Tara King, a new patient with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of a war zone, arrived refusing to eat or speak. Marina sat with her each night playing Whisper Project recordings, a poet's ode to courage, a child's letter about heroes, a sailor's tale of coming home. On the 6th night, Tara's fingers curled around Marina's hand, and she whispered, "You're the nurse from the story, aren't you?" Marina's smile was soft. "I'm just someone who didn't leave." Tara's grip tightened, a silent promise to keep fighting, and Marina knew this was why she stayed. The Veterans Wing had become a shrine to connection, thanks to the whispers, that echo wall Marina had started. What began as a single bulletin board was now a sprawling collage of letters, drawings, and photos, each one a testament to the power of being seen. Families added their stories, and patients who'd long been silent began to speak, inspired by the words pinned there. At the heart of the wall was a letter, its edges curling with age, written in a child's uneven scrawl and adorned with crayon hearts. It was from Ellie, the girl whose note had touched Marina years ago, thanking her for helping her father, a veteran, find his smile. Ellie was no longer a child. Now a nursing intern at Walter Reed, her name tag read E. Miller, and her shy demeanor belied a fierce determination. On her first day, Marina had welcomed her, asking, "Why this path?" Ellie's eyes had shone. "Because of you. Your story gave my dad hope when he was lost. Now he's here with me." She gestured to a man outside his wheelchair, framed by the morning light, his face weathered but alive. He raised a hand in a salute, and Marina, her throat tight, nodded back. Ellie's journey from a child's letter to a nurse's scrubs was proof that a whisper could plant seeds that bloomed across years. Specialist Dean Granger, the soldier whose silence had sparked Marina's courage, had become a symbol of resilience. His recovery was a tapestry of small triumphs, a thumb raised, a salute, a moment of standing with parallel bars. But one morning, as Marina adjusted his IV, he looked at her and spoke. "Hi," he said, the word rough and faint, like a stone breaking the surface of a still pond. Marina froze, her heart stopping. "Hi," he repeated, his voice stronger, his eyes alive with effort. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she sat beside him, her voice trembling. "Dean, I heard every word you couldn't say." He reached for her hand, his grip firm. "Thank you for being my voice," he said, each syllable a victory over the trauma that had silenced him. They sat together, the room quiet except for the steady beep of machines, the flag outside at half-mast for another fallen soldier. But inside, life was being reclaimed, not with fanfare, but with the simple power of presence. Dean's journey from silence to speech was a testament to Marina's persistence, a reminder that healing often began with someone who refused to walk away. Beyond Walter Reed, Marina's whisper had reshaped the world in ways she'd never anticipated. Project Honor Return, inspired by her discovery of Charles McHenry's unclaimed Purple Heart, had reunited hundreds of medals with families, or placed them at graves with the dignity they deserved. A cemetery in Virginia now bore a marker for Charles, funded by donations sparked by Marina's story, its stone etched with "Remembered Always." Schools wove her tale into lessons not as a saga of fame, but as a study in compassion. Nursing programs reported record applicants, many citing the whisper nurse as their spark. The Whisper project had evolved with apps and community hubs, making it accessible to all. A truck driver in Oregon recorded a message that reached a veteran in a Florida hospital, pulling him from despair. A choir in Louisiana Kennedy's home state sent a hymn that played in a New York ward, coaxing laughter from a patient who'd forgotten how. These moments, small and scattered, were the true measure of Marina's impact, proof that a single act could ripple endlessly. One evening, as Marina finished her shift, a letter arrived, slipped under her locker door in a plain envelope. The handwriting was bold, familiar, and her pulse quickened as she opened it. Dear Marina, it read, "Some stories are fleeting, but yours is a beacon. Your whisper taught me to listen differently, to lead with heart. You showed us that courage can be quiet, and service is its own reward. With gratitude, John Kennedy." Inside was a small pin, unadorned but heavy with meaning, inscribed, "For service beyond duty." Marina held it, her fingers tracing the words, and placed it beside Ellie's letter and her brother's photo in her locker. Her brother, a Marine lost in Fallujah, had been her reason for becoming a nurse. His memory, a quiet guide. Now the pin joined that sacred space, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the lives she'd touched, the hope she'd kindled. Marina's own loss had shaped her, but so had her purpose. She rarely spoke of her brother, but his photo pinned inside her locker was a daily touchstone, his young face a reminder of why she fought for others. When asked to address a class of nursing students, she hesitated, uneasy with attention, but agreed for Dean Tara Charles and Ellie's dad. Standing before the group, she offered no grand speech, only a simple truth. Speak when others can't. Stay when others leave. Whisper with purpose, always. The students leaned forward, their faces a mix of awe and resolve. One asked, "How do you keep going when it's exhausting?" Marina thought of her brother's sacrifice. Dean's first word, Ellie's crayon hearts. "Because someone needs you," she said, "and that's enough." The room fell silent, not with emptiness, but with understanding, the kind that settles deep and changes how you move through the world. The lessons of Marina's story were clear, etched in the lives it had transformed. First, speaking for the voiceless is an act of courage that can shift destinies. A single whisper like Marina's to Kennedy gave Dean a voice and inspired a nation. Second, persistence and compassion, even in the smallest acts, create lasting change. Marina's daily care, her refusal to abandon her patients, brought healing where silence once reigned. Finally, everyone has the power to inspire, not through fame, but through heartfelt action. Marina, an ordinary nurse, showed that one voice used with purpose can mend, connect, and uplift. These lessons were a call to the students and to all who heard her story to live with intention, to see the unseen, to care without expecting reward. They were a reminder that heroism isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a whisper that refuses to be ignored. As Marina left the classroom, she passed room 108B, now home to a new patient, a young man with a faraway gaze. She paused at the whispers that echo wall, where a fresh letter had been pinned. "Dear Nurse Marina, I was ready to give up, but your story made me want to try again." Anonymous. She smiled, her heart full, and continued down the hall, her sneakers soft against the floor. Outside, the world spun on new challenges, new battles. But inside Walter Reed, the whispers endured, each one a spark of hope, a promise that no one would be forgotten. Marina walked on, ready for her next shift, her next patient, her next chance to speak for those who couldn't. And somewhere in a classroom or a hospital or a quiet home, someone else was whispering, inspired by a nurse who showed that even the smallest voice could change everything.